Okay, so Grant keeps his promise to Romero, and the Union Army, the U.S. Army, uh, goes into South Texas. They stage all kinds of drills, like they have pontoon bridges, which seem to indicate that they might go into northern Mexico to fight the Imperial Army. Um, and they're there to show grand symbolic support of the of Juarez, but also, I mean, they're it's a real problem for the French army, the Imperial Army in northern Mexico, and as I had just said in my previous podcast, suddenly now the enemies of the Imperial Army, the army of Benito Juarez, there's just a flood of weapons going into northern Mexico. And even beyond the weapons that Grant basically gives the Mexican army, there's a huge surplus of weaponry in the United States because the Civil War is over. And the Mexican government is able to purchase as many guns as it wants as well. So the end of the Civil War, as Juarez anticipated, he's not a dumb guy. He's actually an amazing guy, quite heroic, I think. He knows what's going on. He knows it's not like he completely embraces the United States. He has, I think, probably a justifiably cynical view of the United States. But he knows that at least when the war is over, that at least that he's going to get the guns that he wants from the North, and this is what happens. Uh, One other digression. I think I told y'all I went to Mexico City earlier, like in like January, I guess Super Bowl weekend. And if you go to Mexico City, which you should, it's really spectacular, very safe, pretty cheap these days. Great museums, great food. It's really a cool town. Only 2 hours by air. Uh, uh, Chapultepec Palace is a beautiful spot. It's a high spot, probably about half an hour from the Zocalo, the center of Mexico City. And Chapultepec Palace was where Maximilian built. Well, it was built before he got there, but he added on to it. It's where he lived, and it's where he governed Mexico. And today it's a beautiful, beautiful. It's open to the public. It's a spectacular view of Mexico City because, as I said, it's very high up and you can overlook the Avenue Reforma. You can, if it's a clear day, you can see the mountains surrounding Mexico City, and it's basically kind of a public park there. And we were there on a Saturday, and it's just very lively, just a really terrific place to visit, and it has quite a bit of the mementos, including, for instance, the carriage that Maximilian rode, and after his execution, Juarez rode the carriage. And then, about 5 or 10 minutes from Chapultepec Palace, on the other side of the park, is the Anthropology Museum in Mexico City, which is one of the great museums on earth. Just a spectacular collection of all kinds of basic Indian civilizations that were in what's now Mexico, and just a gorgeous, gorgeous building. So go if you can. When we went, it only cost us $240 round trip. Amazingly cheap. Anyway, so things go sour for Maximilian and Napoleon III after the Union defeats the Confederacy in the Civil War. Uh, Now, although the United States is not going to go to war with France, it's putting maximum pressure, diplomatic pressure, on Napoleon III to withdraw the French troops out of Mexico. And Napoleon III begins to recognize by 1866, 1867 that he's bitten off more than he can chew in Mexico, especially now that the Mexican army is fully armed. There's a very, very famous battle which is completely unknown in the U.S. It happened just on the other side of the Rio Grande, a little bit west of Matamoros. It was the Battle of Santa Gertrudis, and it happened in June of 1866. So we're a year out from the end of the U.S. Civil War. And what happened was is that you'd had a large imperial army stationed in Matamoros in northern Mexico. There was a bit of some of the portions of this, the Imperial Army, the Army of Maximilian, were taking a wagon train or a large train. It was about 1,000 troops, 1,500 troops, all kinds of supplies, gold, that kind of a thing, from Matamoros to Monterrey. And they were annihilated at the Battle of Santa Gertrudis in June of 1866 by the liberal army of Benito Juarez. And basically, this meant this was the end of the imperial occupation of northern Mexico. Very quickly, Maximilian pulls his troops out of the Mexican north. He pulls them out of Matamoros. There are some interesting aspects to the Battle of Santa Gertrudis in 1866. One of them was the participation of African American troops from the United States. What had happened is a number of the troops that Grant sent to the border after the U.S. Civil War were black troops, were African American troops that had joined the Union Army. And Grant urged them to go. He urged all American troops, but he urged troops on the border to go and fight the French. And he offered them their bonuses very quickly. Once you got out of the Army, people in the Army, soldiers in the Army, were paid bonuses. And also, Juarez at this point had enough resources to also give Union Army veterans bonuses if they joined his army. And I'm not talking about, it wasn't a huge number of men, but there were troops, many of them African American, who actually came into Mexico and fought for Juarez. And they were especially necessary when it came to artillery, because the U.S. had advanced artillery, and the army of Juarez didn't quite know how to use this artillery, and it needed some specialists. So there's an element, anyway, of U.S. troops that had left the Union Army or the U.S. Army and come into Mexico to fight for Juarez. Now, Mexican historians to this day really downplay the number of U.S. troops that fought for Juarez in northern Mexico, and for good reason. Mexican historians don't want the story to get across that the reason that Maximilian was defeated was because of the United States. And they're right. Maximilian would have been defeated in any event. I'm quite sure of it. It just would have taken longer. But basically, he had no support. He had no popular support. There was tremendous opposition to him. And the folks that defeated Maximilian were the Mexicans themselves. But they did have some help in terms of weapons that came in from the United States, and some from very specific appearance of U.S. Army veterans who had fought in the Civil War, many of them African Americans. Maybe we're talking about a couple of dozen, maybe a couple hundred at most, that came in and fought with the Mexican Army, and especially showed the Mexican Army how to use its artillery. So anyway, 1866, the Imperial Army under Maximilian was driven out of northern Mexico, and by that point, Maximilian was staring down the barrel of a gun. Now, in 1865, in October of 1865, Maximilian issued what was called the Black Order, and basically what this order was is that anybody that was caught fighting against him could be summarily executed without a trial. So what you start having in Mexico beginning in the fall of 1865 is the French intervention, what we call the French intervention, really what I've said many times is the French invasion of Mexico, becomes even bloodier than it had been. But the tide of the war goes against Maximilian. Napoleon III finally realizes that he has to withdraw his army. He's got all kinds of problems in Europe. His enemies in Europe had taken advantage of his disaster in Mexico to make a number of moves against Napoleon III. This really weakens him. And you could argue it ultimately destroys his regime. But by 1867, early 1867, Napoleon III starts pulling out his troops from Mexico. Maximilian is offered a chance to escape, but he decides to stay in Mexico. And what happens is, outside of Mexico, in Querétaro, if you speak Spanish, I apologize for my horrible Spanish, he's captured. And in June of 1867, there are the Mexican soldiers that executed him. He was captured, and along with two other supporters of the Maximilian regime, he's executed. Let me see if there's a. Oh, there's a picture of the time of the execution of Maximilian. He's executed in June of 1867, and basically the stated reason that Juarez had him executed was because of this decree where Maximilian had ordered the execution of Juarez's soldiers without trial. But also, what Juarez is doing is he's sending a message to monarchical Europe. He's sending a message really to the world that Europe has to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, at least the European armies do. That Republican government, however imperfect, was going to be the form of government that dominated the Western Hemisphere, especially the Spanish-speaking nations of the Western Hemisphere. So what you have with the execution of Maximilian in June of 1867, to me, that marks the end of the crisis of the 1860s in North America. The intertwined crisis that began with the U.S. Civil War, that quickly spilled into Mexico, and that ended not with the Confederate surrender, although that was obviously very important in the United States, but the North American crisis of the 1860s ended, in my view anyway, in June of 1867 with the execution of Maximilian. And I have to say, one of the people that's backing me up on this is U.S. Grant himself. This is how he saw the 1860s as well. He saw it as a continental crisis, not just a U.S. crisis.